I'm going to show you something from Pinocchio. Now this is an initiation ritual. It's a journey to the depths, so it's a journey to the underworld. It's the consequence of a collapse in previous personality and the disintegration of that previous personality into a chaotic state prior to rebirth. Now what happens in Pinocchio, which by the way was released at about the same time that World War II was brewing, and which also contains one of the best representations of the individual motivations for fascism that I've ever seen anywhere. That's the scenes that are associated with Pleasure Island. Remember, all the puppet is trying to become a real boy, right? So he's a marionette to begin with. Something else is pulling his strings. Well, for Jung, that's your habitual state of being. Something else is pulling your strings. Even the idea that you're autonomous is the consequence of something else pulling your strings. And for Jung, what you needed to do was find out exactly who and what is pulling your strings and decide if that's the direction in which you want to go. And that's really what happens to Pinocchio, because we're going to watch Pinocchio, part of it, in the Pinocchio story. He starts out as a marionette. Now, he's a marionette made by a good father, because Geppetto is a good father. He's a good craftsman and so on. So he's a marionette with a benevolent puppeteer. But as soon as he develops some autonomy, then he becomes prey to forces that are elements of the demonic archetype. In fact, the worst bad guy in the entire movie turns into Satan himself at one point in the movie. He basically has horns and a bright red face, and he manifests himself as so terrifying that the coyote, wolf, fox, and the cat that are trying to corrupt Pinocchio are terrified because they get like they're criminals, they're petty criminals and deceptive and so forth, but when they get a look at who's pulling their strings, it's enough to terrify them. And so Pinocchio goes through a series of temptations of various sorts, including a Freudian temptation, and the Freudian temptation is to remain weak and sickly instead of becoming a real person, so it's an Oedipal problem. And another problem that faces Pinocchio is that he's offered false celebrity as a way of solving his life's problems, so he's offered the opportunity to become an actor, and what that means is a deceitful fake who's constructed a persona that makes him appear far more valuable than he really is. So the movie outlines two pathological modes of movement towards maturity, one being a phony, and the other taking the easy way out and hyper valuing all your pathology so that you become dependent. So anyways, and then another mode of pathological development is offered to Pinocchio, which is to do nothing but engage in short-term impulsive and destructive play. And that's on Pleasure Island. But when he goes to Pleasure Island, he finds that it's actually ruled by demonic forces with faceless entities who are transforming all the pleasure-seeking marionettes to braying donkeys who are slaves. It's like... So, Pinocchio escapes from that, and he does it basically by jumping into the unknown, and that's where we're going to start our exposure to his initiation. I'd like you to walk me through what's happened to you since the events in Evergreen, and bring everybody up to date on my end. So, man, maybe you could start with what happened at Evergreen, although I suspect many of the people watching this do know. Does that seem reasonable?
Sure. Yeah, we can start there. I think we should probably err in the direction of being sparse with the details and see where it leads us.
Yeah.
So in 2017, I was teaching at Evergreen, as was Heather, my wife, and she was literally Evergreen's most popular professor. I wasn't too far behind. I was very popular as well. Our classes were always overfull, and we accepted more people than we had to and had to turn some away anyway. And then in actually 2016, the new president of the college, George Bridges, began an initiative or a set of initiatives surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these initiatives included the impaneling of a committee that was supposed to look into racism at the college, its impacts, and to propose solutions. And as it became clear what they were alleging and proposing, Heather and I became very alarmed. And I began to speak out, at first in faculty meetings. And then when the ability to speak out in faculty meetings became non-existent, I took to our faculty and staff email list to talk about the threat to the college that was created by these initiatives. And that, of course, brought about exactly what you would imagine, which were accusations that I was motivated by some kind of racism or white supremacy or white fragility, or who knows what the accusations were exactly. But in any case, I fought back anyway. And my sense was I had tenure and I was well liked and I was well known at the college. I'd been there for 14 years. And so I didn't think they had the power to get rid of me. And that gave me the ability to say what needed to be said about these proposals. Well, the upshot is that ultimately protesters, 50 students that I had never met, showed up at my classroom, accused me of racism, demanded that I either be fired or resign. I told them I wouldn't. And riots broke out at the college in which faculty and administrators were kidnapped. I was apparently hunted car to car on campus by protesters. The police were stood down by the college president, and we were basically left to fend for ourselves with student patrols roving the campus with weapons, baseball bats, and the like. So it was a chaotic scene. There was a lot of interest in it because it was very colorful. But of course, most people back in 2017 dismissed this as, yes, an overreaction, but you know how college students are. And those of us who saw it up close knew that that couldn't be the case, that it would ultimately spill out into civilization. And we, of course, were right. And now it's everywhere. We see it taking over institution after institution. In the US and Canada, we see it making tremendous strides in government, and there's no telling where it ends.
And what is, I mean, I have a bunch of questions that come out of that. I mean, so I'll lay out three. Why in the world did this bother you enough so that you took a stand, especially given your political leanings? Because you were, which I'm not criticizing, by the way, I'm just stating that it isn't obvious to begin with why it would be you that would take a stand, say, rather than someone else. But you did. And so I'm curious about why. And what is it that you saw coming? And what is this it that you're referring to? You've had a lot of time to be thinking about this now. It's been 4 years. And I mean, the other thing I want to ask you about is your life was thrown completely upside down, you and your wife. You don't have your job at the university anymore, either of you, despite the fact that you were tenured professors. It's not an easy thing to get another toehold in academia once you've been a tenured professor somewhere, especially if you've gone through what you went through, because no hiring committee anywhere is going to give you any consideration once you've been tarred by scandal, regardless of what your role in it was. They're far too conservative to ever do anything like that. And so, okay, so I don't know if I can remember the order in which I asked those questions, but I think the first one was, why in the world were you compelled to object? And what is it that you were objecting to, do you think?
Well, it's a funny question for you to pose to me, because I have the feeling that the answer will be entirely native to you. I literally don't believe I had any choice. People frequently ask me why I stood up. And my sense is, if I think through the alternative, I simply can't live with it. I can't sleep.
Yeah,
right?
But that doesn't seem to bother most people. So I don't get that.
Well,
like, why you?
Well, right. I mean, I guess that's the thing I'm discovering. So you alluded to my political leanings, and you and I both know what you mean by that. I'm a liberal, and I describe myself sometimes as a reluctant radical. By that, I mean that I believe we must engage in radical change if we are to survive as a species. But I also know that radical change is very dangerous. And so it's not like, I find most people who would call themselves radicals feel like radical change is always called for. And I don't. My sense is I hope to see change that makes civilization good enough that I get to be a conservative, that I get to say, actually, we're doing so well that we have no choice but to preserve this. If we try to improve it, we'll mess it up. That's where I want to go. But what I'm discovering is that the bedrock of my liberalism is nothing like the underpinnings of the so-called liberalism of most of the people on the left side of the political spectrum. My liberalism comes from a sense that, yes, compassion is a virtue, but that policy must be based on a dispassionate analysis of problems. It is based on an understanding that the magic of the West comes from a tension between those who aspire to change things for the better, and those who recognize the danger of changing them at all. And so in any case, I think the short answer is we look around the world and everybody makes arguments that sound as if they come from first principles, but most people do not arrive at conclusions from first principles. If they extrapolate at all, they don't do it very well. And that results in severe compartmentalization of thought. And that means that when confronted with changes that threaten a system on which we are dependent, most people don't recognize it. And if they do recognize it, they wouldn't know what to do about it. So how can I put it in plain terms? I had no choice because I was as if on a ship where somebody had proposed to fix our course through a field of icebergs and navigate based on some absurd theory with no grounding in fact. Somebody had to object. And I was a little surprised at how few and far between the objectors were. But, if I'm to be totally candid about it, at the point that things went haywire at Evergreen, I had watched video of you reacting to protesters in Toronto. And it had made so much sense to me at a number of different levels. I recognized you as somebody who knew that although the initial proposals were arguably symbolic, that they were connected to things that ultimately were very much about an exercise of power and a transfer of well-being, and that it was therefore, you felt obligated to stand up and say no, which resulted, as you know better than anyone, in you being mocked for overreacting. And then here we are years later, and it turns out that you saw with absolute clarity what others couldn't even imagine.
Yes, but I certainly didn't see what was going to happen to me.
Right.
With clarity, so being
right.
quite
I don't
a strange route.
It wasn't possible to see what would happen with specificity to you. But am I correct in seeing that you knew that something very dramatic was likely to come from your standing on principle, and that didn't provide any license to do anything but make that stand?
I really can't say, it's a while ago now, so that's part of it. But so much has happened to me that's been so strange in the last 4 years that I have a very difficult time making any sense of it. I can't even really think about, especially the last 2 years, I can't really think about them in any consistent and comprehensive way. I mean, my family situation has been so catastrophic, and my illness and my wife's illness, it's just been, although she recovered completely, thank God, it's just been so utterly catastrophic that my thinking about it is unbelievably fragmented. I'm struck dumb still to some degree by
by all of what emerged as a consequence of me making the first videos that I made. I went downstairs, talked to my wife and my son. My son was living at home at that time, temporarily. And I said, this piece of legislation is really bothering me because it calls for compelled speech. And I looked at the background documents and something wasn't right. And I said, I need to say something about it. They said, well, go for it. We'll see what happens. And all hell broke loose and continues to break loose, for that matter, which is one of the things that's so bloody strange about it, is it doesn't seem to end. And I would have thought, when it first started, I thought, oh, well, I'd be a flash in the pan for a week or something, or 2 weeks, or a month, or 6 months, or a year, or 2 years, but it doesn't stop. And I really can't understand that. It's beyond my comprehension. Now, I guess it's partly because I continue to communicate my thoughts to some degree, even talking to mainstream media people, although increasingly less, and perhaps not at all from here on in. I mean, I had an interview with the London Times 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, it was published. And, it was just another complete, absolute bloody nightmare for my family, my daughter in particular, because they took her to task in an extraordinarily nasty way. And, and the journalist who did the interview was completely, you couldn't invent her. Not only the way she was so deceitful in what she did, but I learned more about her background afterward as a consequence of another journalist who wrote about her. And, she's a very singular person, to say the least. And so I did feel at the time, like you did, I guess, that I was more afraid of not speaking than I was afraid of speaking. And I have something against being told what to say. It's like, I'll pay the price for what I have to say. I'm not going to pay the price to say what you want me to say. You go say it yourself and see what the hell happens. And, maybe that's just a kind of incomprehensible stubbornness in some sense. Although I think I did see the beginnings of what has unfolded since then, although I can't even really put my finger on what it is that's happening. So,
well, I wonder a little bit about, in some ways, there's nothing good about why you were absent from the scene. But there may be something good about your having not been there for every moment of it and being able to come back to the discussion with something like fresh eyes, because a lot of this is developmental. And, you say you're surprised that that this is continuing. And I must say, I'm having the same experience. I feel like I was picked up, my whole family was picked up by a tornado and we haven't been put down. And, I sort of feel like we were joined in the tornado during 2020. It was such a crazy year that a lot of people whose lives were continuing in some normal fashion are suddenly aware that things are wildly off kilter.
And so what was it like going to teach at Grace Church School?
Well, it was really nice because I was used to a corporate environment, I guess. Because of my time that I had done in a previous job at HBO. I was a technical manager. It was a whole other career. And, I was very concerned that I reported to the right people, or, what's the org structure, and they were just like, well, just you have colleagues and you can discuss things with them, and we're not going to make you do anything. You can talk to us. It's a very friendly environment. I mean, there were serious expectations, like, and everyone took their jobs very seriously, but there really was a sense of belonging and community. That was very welcoming, actually, and very energizing, I will say, because I wasn't used to that. I didn't expect it. And so I would remain aloof from it, at the beginning, like, what are these people? Why are they always smiling at me? Like, what's going on? I don't know why. But gradually you loosen up, and it was kind of corny, but I would kind of go along with it. And
it's a good kind of corny.
Yeah. And it did actually, I warmed up a little bit. I did feel like I was a part of things, and I was able to sort of transmit that to others too.
And so what happened over time?
a very gradual change that, I would say, well, within the first 3 years, one of the tenets of our school was that every employee and every faculty and staff member had to attend a seminar called Undoing Racism.
Mm-hmm. That was your HR department, was it, or who?
Yeah, it was. It was a mandate from the dean of faculty at the time, and
that was a requirement.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And so I went to that, and that was a very interesting experience.
It's hard to what would you say, refuse a call to anti-racism.
Sure.
Who would do that?
What kind of monster? Yeah. And I went into it and I actually felt energized and I was converted. I had a sort of, I am white and I'm privileged and you're right. We need to take care of this. And there were people in a circle and people of all different races and backgrounds, and it was facilitated. And, later I looked back on it and I realized sort of how they did it. They did it in a very interesting, seductive way.
And what way was that?
Well, as I recall, they started out, well, there was sort of two parts. The first part was the history since, the slave ships landed on American soil. And then throughout time, leading up to the present. And then they focused for the second half of the session, they focused on how to help a community that has been shaped by all of this. And very early in the session, they said, we want you to withhold any judgment of anyone's choice or agency. Anyone, any of, the minority Black populations that we're talking about here. We want you to simply bracket or put, withhold any analysis of the choices that people make, because that will often lead to a misunderstanding or insensitivity towards what's happening.
So why do you focus on that specifically, that issue specifically?
Well, because it was as they retold the history and as they talk about the present circumstances, they never actually revisited that. So you're constantly focused on the oppressed population in terms of what is acting upon it, acting upon those individuals. And, to me, that's like denying a certain agency, right? But they never actually lifted the blinders off at the end. Like they would put everyone sort of acknowledged that they were going to go along with this at the beginning. And I was like, really? We're going to do that? We're going to treat people as less than human? Well, okay, it must be like a temporary thing.
And why did you see that as treating them as less than human? I mean, I presume that the people on the other side of the fence would say, well, we're all caught like corks on the sea and in the throes of vast social movements over which we have little or no control. And who are you to cast judgment on people who have been relatively deprived in that regard compared to you? It's possible to make a fairly stringent moral case that that's the appropriate mode of behavior, but there was something in you that objected to that, and you remember that now.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that you said that you were energized by this and pulled in by it. Why do you think it caught you as well?
Well, it was a social thing, right? It's the people in a circle and people are talking about their experiences and people are saying, as a Black person, this has happened to me. And at one point they actually, it's empathy, right? You care about people. You feel, if you're sitting face to face with someone, of course I'm going to be sympathetic and empathetic and people are narrating, but the problem I think is generalizing that to groups and, getting you to make a different set of assumptions about those groups based on a sort of, selective way that the empathy is leveraged, I would say.
Well, there's also the implicit, what would you say, the implicit perceptual and categorical structure that comes along with it, which is the a priori assumption that the appropriate classification for human beings is by group.
Yeah.
And that's so implicit, but so pervasive that it, in some sense, never needs to be stated. And as soon as you assume that the group level is the appropriate level, then you're bound to minimize or even forbid discussion of such things as individual agency.
This episode was brought to you by Bespoke Post. This spring, revamp your daily routine with Bespoke Post and their new seasonal lineup of must-have Box of Awesome collections. Bespoke Post partners with small businesses and emerging brands to bring you the most unique goods every month. I love their Frontier box because one of the items is a replica of the 1980s French pocket knife Pablo Picasso used to carve his sculptures. Unless you've canceled Picasso, in which case you can still have the very chic pocket knife. No matter what you have going on this season, Box of Awesome has you covered. From camping gear essentials to cookout must-haves like hot sauces and barbecue rubs, Box of Awesome has collections for every part of your life. They release new boxes every month, valued at $70, but you only pay a fraction of that price. Plus, 90% of what's inside comes from small, up-and-coming brands. It's free to sign up, and you can skip a month or cancel anytime. Get 20% off your first monthly box when you sign up at boxofawesome.com and enter promo code Peterson at checkout. That's boxofawesome.com, code Peterson for 20% off your first box. boxofawesome.com, code Peterson.
So tell us about the blog. When did you start writing your blog?
In July 2019.
And why did you start to do that? I mean, you have your research career, you're an undergraduate, or you're a teacher as well. You're working in the community, you have a full life. What compelled you to start a blog?
I love to write, and I think it's a reflex that I have from war. So I used to write my diary in Arabic and in French, and I have them with me. They came with me in a box and went across 3 provinces. So I love to write. So in July 2019, I didn't have the chance maybe to say what I wanted to say on a platform. So I decided to have my own blog and just write for the pleasure of writing. I write about Lebanon, maybe half of the time. I write about Canada, Quebec, here. I just write and express views in relation to what is happening in Canada and in the world. And I think I'm seeing something very worrisome, and maybe that's part of why maybe I'm writing, because I'm seeing that we are in times where we can't talk about things. Well, look what's happening in my story. Like people are afraid. They may think things when they are at home privately, but they may not express them publicly, or maybe because of, political correctness or whatever. I'm not that type of person. Like what I write, or Bambi, the name of the person writing, is actually the meaning of my first name, Rima. It means a little deer in Arabic, and Bambi is that deer. So Bambi's afkar are Bambi's thoughts. So what I write is actually whom I am, what my own thoughts privately and on that blog. I sometimes write maybe, personal things about birthdays of loved ones or whatever. It's a blog, right? So that's it.
And what kind of audience does your blog have?
Well, at first I thought it had maybe 10 people. Maybe first myself, I was writing for myself, but I thought family members. And then when that story happened, for once I searched. I usually don't have the time to do that. And I thought it was like really getting 2,000 on one day. And then another day I checked 500, something like that. I thought, oh my goodness, I was really thinking, I'm writing, I'm using during the pandemic, my in-laws or my parents sometimes with some issues, or writing about the Beirut explosion. I interviewed friends about what they are going through with the financial crisis, things like that.
Right. So it had expanded beyond the small number of people that you had assumed were reading it.
Absolutely.
Exactly what happened to you? So you were living what I would presume was a pretty comfortable and happy life, as you've described, being a teacher and a researcher. You spun off this blog on the side. And then what happened? One day you were notified by the university. Tell us exactly the story.
I can tell you, but I want to say, yes, I'm extremely happy, even in the pandemic, even despite the Beirut explosion and everything, I'm finding my ways of, living, coping. New Brunswick is amazing, all Canada, but we're also lucky to be in a semi-rural areas where even the pandemic did not hit us as hard as Toronto or bigger places in Montreal. So in that sense, I was all okay until that February 22nd, where I can tell you that story because it's my story, that's my part. So, and it's in the media actually. I was having symptoms of actually like COVID-19. I wasn't sure, and I was very, very, very sick. I usually run fast and jump and go on the stairs, and I couldn't take the stairs. I would stop, couldn't breathe. And so on that day, the Monday where it happened, I went for testing. It was finally negative, but I came back, did my work day, and then at the end of the day, I was lying on the couch thinking that I was resting. I got a phone call from a kind former student telling me, Dr. Azhar, you need to know what is happening. And I thought, are you okay? What is happening? I was worried. And he said, no, I'm fine. You are in trouble, in big trouble. So the story started in the social media. I'm not on social media myself. So for me, I chose that blog because it's what suits my personality, what I, writing and having enough space to write. And so anyways, I enjoy reading social media and I do, but I'm not on it. So I read quickly and I thought, okay, it was there. And
this was on Twitter? This was all happening on Twitter?
On Twitter.
Or where was it? On Twitter.
I don't know if it was happening on elsewhere as a Facebook, I guess, but I saw the Twitter myself. And then an email got out of the university publicly. So not on Twitter, on Facebook, or the public channels of the university saying, it's public. So I'm not saying what is not public. Trigger warning, that blog, we dissociate ourselves from it and encouraging complaints.
Okay, so what were people saying on Twitter, and who was it that was saying it, and how many of them were there? Do you know?
A lot, and like it was a big thing on social media. And there has been also at one point, a threat of violence on social media and things like that. So it was then, I don't want to forget that part, when there were 3 student organizations asked for my removal from my position at my university, and also affiliations elsewhere, like University of New Brunswick, Université de Moncton as well. So it got really
okay,
big.
So I want to zero in on this. So there's some students primarily on social media, on Twitter primarily, and they're complaining about your blog.
Yes.
And they're students who are part of student organizations. And then the student organizations themselves, 3 of them, are contacting the people that you're working for or with, suggesting that you're not the sort of person they should be associating with and asking for your removal.
Exactly.
Now, you said there were lots of students doing this. And I'd like to get an estimate of something like a number. So does a lot mean 500 or does it mean 5?
So in between, maybe. I don't know precisely the answer. But
well, the reason I'm asking is because one of the things I'm curious about is just how many people have to complain before complaints are taken with some degree of seriousness. Now, I've dealt with ethics boards, for example, at my own university, and they have a policy that every complaint should be investigated thoroughly. And I'm not very fond of that policy, particularly because there are a lot of people who cause a fair bit of trouble for absolutely no reason. And it seems to me that complaints need to pass something approximating a reasonable threshold before they're dealt with, let's say, seriously. And so, it's striking when you're talking about this that you don't know how many people actually came after you, because they came after you on social media. And it's certainly not in the hundreds. It's unlikely to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's unlikely to be in the dozens. Is it 10? Is it 15? And were they students who were actually in your classes, or were they just people who read your blog? And what were they objecting to in your blog exactly? What did you say that was in principle, or do you even know what it is that they're upset about? What I've read is that you made some claim that Canada wasn't systemically racist, that wasn't the right way of looking at the country. And is there So, and to me, that means now, is that the case now that at a university, if I stand up and say that I don't believe that the lens of systemic racism is the proper way to analyze Canada, especially compared to other countries, that now I'm so reprehensible that I deserve to be suspended if a couple of people object? Is that the situation that we're looking at? Or am I being too hard on the university?
Well, I think it's hard to answer that question. So
I know.
The numbers that I know of now, I know them because of what happened and how many people. But before, I didn't know anything. I personally found it amazing that my university, my employer that I love and respect, did not call me to tell me what was happening. That I learned it in that.
Did your union?
My union is doing what needs to be done, and I'm very grateful. But I didn't know about that. I knew that's how I knew it. And then after that first call, friends from Nova Scotia, Amherst, Nova Scotia, called, hearing in the news and the radio. It was all everywhere. I have to admit, I may be wrong, but there may have been a flavor for that during that month. So it was. Like my story was sort of a scapegoat for something that is much bigger than a deer, a simple deer, a silly deer. Sometimes we're not allowed to write serious things or silly things or be wrong or change our mind. So what precisely, I don't know, but I personally am allergic to identity politics, given my background. So I may have written things about that or about, it's hard to tell.
But you're still not sure. You're still not sure what it is that, okay, so you're not sure exactly who you offended or how many of them there are, and you're not exactly sure why you offended them. And you're so unsure that what you say is that, as far as you're concerned, you can't safely write down what you think, despite the fact that you have your opinions, given where you came from, given the fact that you've immigrated here, that you can take a look at Canada from the perspective of an insider and an outsider. You're not sure what your crime is.
No, but now because it's in the media, I can talk to that. It's not that I'm not respecting the confidentiality of the process of the investigation report. It's in the media. There is an allegation.
Well, you get the chance to defend yourself. In any case, I mean, you've been suspended, correct?
Yes.
In the fall. Okay, and you said your university didn't even call you when all this blew up, and which is typical in my experience of the way institutions are reacting to this sort of thing. So an unnamed number of students made comments that you have views that are in some sense reprehensible, even though you don't know what they are. And the response of your university, despite the fact that you have tenure, that you're an accomplished scientist, that you're a popular undergraduate researcher, that you have tenure, the response of your university was to not call you, but suspend you for the fall, pending an investigation. An investigation into what exactly? Have they told you what you did wrong?
Of course, I saw those complaints, I can tell you, I think that part I can say it, is most of them are related to the blog, and that's fine. People have the right not to like what you say, what I say, what anyone else is saying. That's fine. But when we get into false allegations, it's a different story. Right?
There's also a difference between having the right not to like what you say on your blog and aggregating behind your back and conspiring to contact all your employers and to insist that you be removed because you're reprehensible and hypothetically a danger to the, let's say, the safety of students, and to have you removed from your position and have your reputation dragged through the mud and have you exposed in the media. I mean, that's not merely not liking what you said. That's an all-out attack. And it's amazing to me that this handful of students, an unspecified number, has the power to move the administration to produce such a dramatic response. And you keep wavering in some sense as to the nature of your crimes. You said you think it's likely the blog, but I guess there are allegations that go outside the blog as well. Have you ever had trouble with your students in classes that have resulted in complaints?
Never. Ever. All those who know me personally, who can guess who I am in the blog, because I think it shows a little bit that I write a lot, so you can guess, you can see, you can make links, you can see. So, for example, I may criticize a certain politician in one blog, but I can say thank you on another one for doing something good. I'm writing because we cannot comment on media articles. Many times, the comment section is closed, right? So for me, it's my way of doing it. So if they
it doesn't seem to me that it's something that needs to be justified. I mean, first of all, you're a citizen of a free country. You have a right to express yourself any way that you see fit. Second of all, you're a tenured professor and your thoughts are actually protected to a fair degree. And it's protected broadly so that you can think broadly. And the fact that this has happened despite your tenure, well, I guess part of the question that people who are watching might be asking is why the hell should they care about this? And the reason I believe that people should care about this, first of all, is that what happens in the universities ends up happening everywhere else very, very rapidly.
Absolutely.
And if it can happen to someone like you, it seems to me that it can happen to anyone at any time in any place.
Absolutely.
And this unbelievable cowardice that our institutions show in the face of unwarranted allegations, as long as they're the right flavor, is something that should be tremendously worrisome to everyone.
This episode was sponsored by Shopify. Every 28 seconds, an entrepreneur makes their first sale on Shopify. Not selling online means you're missing out on pretty simple passive income. It's almost silly not to try it. The hard part is getting started, but that's never been easier than with Shopify. Shopify lets you start, grow, and manage your business from one place. You get access to their powerful online store and app where you can design your page, process payments, and manage inventory without any coding experience. It's also useful for content creators. They have everything you need to turn your followers into customers. I'm using Shopify for the hangover pills I'm producing. Stay tuned for those. I'm just one in over 1.7 million people already doing it. Start building your next revenue stream with Shopify. Go to shopify.com/JBP, all lowercase, for a free 14-day trial and get full access to Shopify's entire suite of features. Start selling on Shopify today. Go to shopify.com/JBP right now. Shopify.com/JBP.
Tell us about No Safe Spaces first, and then tell us about, your attempts to get it distributed, or the attempts to get it distributed.
Well, I'll start with the movie, and then Dennis will go on to the attempts to be distributed.
I actually wanted it to reverse.
Okay.
But that's fine. Either way.
Dennis and I are very different. We have very different backgrounds, but we do have common sense in common. And I have found more and more, and I'm assuming you guys feel the same way, which is just finding someone with common sense seems to trump all the other characteristics that we're constantly talking about, what region you're born in, or who your team is, or what color your skin is. Dennis and I always had common sense in common, and we struck up a great friendship. We've done many speaking engagements. We've always had a great time in each other's companies. And so when the producers came to us with this idea, I immediately jumped at it just because it selfishly seemed like we could spend a lot of time together talking about a subject that we're both pretty passionate about, which is free speech. And since the time we made this movie, I feel like things have gotten much worse. I think the movie was a bit ahead of its time in terms of what it is, the subject matter. And now I feel like in just the 3 or 4 years since we started, this free speech issue has gone into overdrive. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, a word on the movie and then a word on the distribution. I've said from the beginning, and I'm neither arrogant nor humble. I just pretty much try to see myself in life objectively. So I have said, this is a great movie, and it's not a great movie because I'm in it. Might be a great movie because Adam is in it, but the truth is it's a great movie. And Adam and I happen to be the quote unquote stars, but that's not the point of the movie. I have watched this about 5 times. I have the attention span of a child. And so for something to keep me riveted 5 times speaks immensely about it. It truly is an important movie. It's more important today even than when it was made. about free speech, and it's got movies within the movies. And anyway, people should see it.
I'd like to point out too, just as an advertisement of sorts, there's a Canadian equivalent to that movie called Better Left Unsaid that has faced the same sort of distribution problems that you guys have faced. And it focuses on issues that are more germane to Canada, although also relevant to the US. And so, they deserve a note. They deserve a mention. So
I'm glad you pointed out. I happen to think that things are worse in Canada than in the US. But that's an interesting discussion for either another time or later on today.
So what was your impetus for making, I'm in the movie, so everyone knows.
Let's talk about the distribution. Netflix refused to distribute it, to stream it, which is incredible given how popular the movie is.
Okay, so make a case for that. Like why? Okay, so Netflix should have been incentivized as far as you're concerned by the fact that the movie was economically successful. And there are other streaming agencies too online that are fairly powerful. So Amazon, etc. Have you had any interest from any of the streaming agencies?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I don't know I'll look up the Amazon question. I know that Walmart doesn't sell it in its stores. They have the same thing. All you need really at Netflix or Walmart or any of these is one or two people who are woke to tell, we can't do this. We're going to get a bad name. And then, what is it to Netflix not to listen to somebody who says, oh, Dennis Prager. We know for a fact that it was my name that was the trigger, which is an interesting thing, which one day would be fascinating to discuss. Because whenever my name is raised as this bugaboo, I always say, well, can you say anything in 35 years of broadcasting, 10 books, literally 1,000 columns on the internet, plus tens of thousands of hours of the radio recorded? Say one thing that I have ever said that strikes you as extreme. And so there's never an example. There's literally never. The New York Times did a piece on me. They couldn't find one sentence. They made up something, in fact. They said Prager suggested, and I always tell people, if they don't say said, don't believe the line. Suggested is the New York Times, not what I said. And then they had no quotes. But anyway.
I've had the same experience, Dennis. I have hundreds of hours of.
Of course you have. I know that. I can't find a thing you've ever said that isn't ennobling. I love your work. I wrote the introduction to your biography.
I had this experience as well. And then I have another thought, which is I got into a lot of trouble and I got out of favor with critics because it was widely said that Adam Carolla said women weren't funny. Now, this is perfect, and you guys have experienced a version of this. I did an interview years ago, and the person said at the end, who's funnier, men or women? And I said, well, I think men are. I think it's based on them trying to have sex, essentially. So they had to exercise that muscle a little bit. But I know many female comedians that are funnier than any guy ever went to high school with. That then turned into Adam Carolla said women weren't funny. And then they just ran with it. And that's up there with the.
Well, look, it's pretty credible what you say, because my sense is that there's been a couple of things I've said that have been blown up in the press, and they were exaggerations of the sort that you're describing, taken out of context. I think that in the current climate, if you've ever said anything reprehensible on public record, that you will be slaughtered for it. And so if you haven't been slaughtered for it, the probability that you haven't said anything reprehensible is pretty damn high, because people are combing over the utterances of people like you, trying to find a smoking pistol. I don't know if you can comb over things to find a smoking pistol, but
I was at a Senate subcommittee on the suppression of free speech, testifying about what's happening to PragerU, where hundreds of our videos are placed on the restricted list, meaning if you have a filter against pornography and violence, you actually can't see the video. So one of them was, in fact, one that I had given. I only give 1/10 of the videos. 90% are other people. But I have given a number of videos on the 10 Commandments, for example. And so Senator Ted Cruz asked the representative of Google, Why did you people could see this on YouTube? It is still there. Why did you put Mr. Prager's talk on the Ten Commandments on the restricted list? And the man looked at Senator Cruz and said, because it mentions murder. And I remember humming the Twilight Zone theme because I felt I had entered an alternate universe.
So what do you think the reason was, Dennis? I mean, obviously, look, that's got to be a bit of a PR nightmare for Google to do something like that. So it smacks of a certain degree of incompetence to begin with. And I like to hypothesize incompetence before malevolence. So why do you think it was censored, that specifically? And then why, with regards to, is it reasonable to call what's happening with PragerU censorship? And why do you think it's happening?
Because, well, I'll tell you I'll answer the last one first, and this will help you realize that I think there's more malevolence than incompetence. There is never an instance in the history of the world, and this is my field of study since I was in graduate school at Columbia. That's why I studied Russian, was to read Pravda and visit the Soviet Union on multiple occasions and other communist countries. There is no instance in world history, that is since the Russian Revolution, of the left gaining power and not suppressing speech. Liberals are for free speech. Conservatives are for free speech. The left has never been for free speech.
Okay, so let me ask you a clarifying question there, all right? Because, I'm a Canadian, and I suppose, along with the Scandinavian countries, we're tilted a fair degree to the left compared to the U.S. And so, freedom of speech is in reasonable shape in our countries, those countries that I mentioned. And so when you talk about the left, tell me more specifically what you mean and how you would define that particular because you're not talking about the Democrats per se, I can't imagine, or perhaps you are.
The Democrats used to be, I was a Democrat. The Democrats used to be liberal. The Democrats, when I was a kid in the 70s, Nazis, real Nazis, not people they just call Nazis, real Nazis with swastikas, demonstrated in Skokie, Illinois, because a lot of Jews lived there, especially Holocaust survivors. It was a particularly vicious act. And Jewish groups, the ACLU, liberal groups, the Democratic Party, all defended their right, because in America, anybody could say anything except yell fire in a crowded theater. That is no longer the position. You look. Why did you get in trouble? And I've
wondered about that for a long time.
Okay, so if you're wondering, I'm not. You said something the left didn't like, that you were not going to be told by the government what pronoun you will use.
We need institutions that we can respect and that hold up the standards that have made them what they are. And if they fold, well, how can you expect normal people, say, not to be cowed and intimidated by the same tactics?
Absolutely. Actually, there were two other episodes on my mind, one of which sort of confirmed my theory about what was happening in your case, the other of which suggested different sorts of motivations. So one of them was a case that occurred around the same time as yours, which was a case of a research fellow at St Edmunds College here in Cambridge, who was doing research. He was a sociologist, a very well-known, respectable sociologist. He had his work profiled in The Economist, in top journals. He was fired because there was a mob protesting about his associations, conferences he'd been to, journals that he published in which other people that they found distasteful had published in, and so on. Again, he'd done or said nothing illegal. That was one case, which again, I think illustrates the sorts of pressures that I think were being brought to bear.
And what were the topics for that?
The topics of race and intelligence.
Yes. Well, the intelligence literature is rough. That's for sure.
The whole thing was so chilling, Jordan, because it was decided by an inquiry that was kept secret. Nobody's going to know what the evidence was in this inquiry. So the whole thing was terrifying. The other case was slightly different. So there was another case that concerned me, which was a case where it was an event for the Palestinian Society, where there was a chair from that society, which the university threatened to shut down because they were worried that the chair might be an extremist or something. She wasn't at all. She was a respectable academic from SOAS, and the university imposed its own chair on that. Now that was slightly different because that was responding to another threat of free speech, which is the government's legislation on prevent and anti-terrorism. But those three events were sort of coalescing in my mind around the time that I tried to change the university's free speech policy.
Okay, so let's talk about the change in the free speech policy. What changes did you propose? And then it took a couple of years, as I understand, to really get this through. And I also understand from James that it wasn't that easy to get people to speak in favor of your proposal, but that it was passed, and we need to go into that, by an overwhelming majority of the people who were concerned and able to legislate such things, so to speak, for the university.
Yeah, so I can take you through that. What happened was this was around actually March 2020, so about a year after your case, and the university had decided that it was going to put through a new freedom of speech policy. This is obviously at a time when everyone had other things on their mind, at least in Britain, in March 2020. They didn't offer a vote on it. They just wanted to put it straight through. And it was a policy which I found concerning, especially in light of these incidents. One part of it was that it said that we have a right to free speech, but we must always exercise respect for other people's identities and opinions. Now, that might seem innocuous, but of course, the word respect being so vague can be interpreted.
It doesn't seem innocuous to me.
Indeed.
I mean, it seems terrible because it just removes the first part of protection for free speech. I mean, if you have to be cautious about other people's opinions, much less their identity, well, we should reverse that. Their identity, much less their opinions, is, well, who decides when that's respectful and what? Yeah, it's just weasel words, that.
Exactly. And the bit about identities, I bet they had you in mind when they were saying that, actually. But whenever anyone says, I believe in free speech, but, that's a good sign to me that they don't believe in free speech. And that was the impression that this policy gave off. Other parts of the policy, which may not have been directly explicitly new, but which certainly brought you and those other cases, for instance, the Palestinian Society, to mind, were rules which said that the university could stop speaker events if they thought they were threatening the welfare of students. Notice now, welfare is undefined and could be interpreted broadly, and indeed allow the university to stop events under pretty much any circumstances that they like, speaker events, for instance. So that was the proposed policy in March 2020.
Why did that bother you so much? I mean, you're pretty young and starting your academic career in many ways. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it's a hell of a thing to take on, and it's not without its risks. And I'm always curious about people's motives. It's like there's lots of professors at Cambridge. Why do you think this was your problem?
Well, you flatter me about being young, but I will say that I guess there were two things. One of them was philosophical, and one was more to do with the nature of the job. So philosophically speaking, my basic philosophical position is what you might call classical liberal. So my basic value is individual liberty. I would, in terms of what I do in my political engagement, even my professional engagement to some extent, that's the ultimate and most important value. So for me, it really touched a nerve. It touched something that was the core of my identity, if you want to use that appalling word. The other aspect, which I said was professional, was simply to do something I alluded to earlier, which was, what is this job for? It's part of your duty as an academic, I would have thought. Academics are normally cautious, as they should be, but the one thing that they shouldn't be cautious about is defending the ultimate purpose of the academy, and that cannot be pursued without free speech and without the ability to question freely beliefs that are held by the majority, also beliefs that are held by minorities, and without worrying about who you're going to offend, who's going to be hurt by your words, especially in a subject like philosophy, and I dare say in a subject like yours, and certainly in a subject like James's. You can't have free discussion if every time you talk about something, you're frightened that you're going to offend the other person and then they might report you and you might get in trouble. I can't do my job. I don't expect James can. I don't expect you can if discussion is curtailed in that way. So
no scientists can, because that freedom of inquiry and the freedom to upset traditional truths, let's say, well, in a really fundamental sense, that's what science is all about. And as let's say a creative scientist, you're always working against what's established, because otherwise what you discovered wouldn't be new. And you're always going to be facing people who are upset for one reason or another by your hypotheses and your research. So it's not a side issue here. It's crucial to the academy as such.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely.
But that still doesn't explain why you made it your problem, say, when so many people were perfectly willing to remain silent.
Well, one thing I would say was that I was slightly surprised when I wrote. So after the university's policy came out, there was a discussion. What's called a discussion in Cambridge University really means that you write a paper and it's published in the university magazine. And so I sent a short paper off proposing some changes to these policies and stating my objections. And I had expected, this being Cambridge University, that many other people would do the same, because I didn't think I was alone in being concerned about this. Nobody else did. So that was the first point at which I realized. So there was no real bravery on my part, because I had expected at that point that a lot of other people would be jumping in. Nobody did. So that was the point at which I realized that I was perhaps more isolated than I'd expected. To go back to your question about motivations, I mean, I don't know what more I can tell you. I mean, these are things that matter to me. I don't really care if anyone else is doing it or not.
And did you face any trouble? So you voiced your opinion and you wanted to modify this document, which had, let's say, politically correct underpinnings. And did it cause grief for you? Were people outraged by what you said, or did things proceed as a matter of course?
Well, it was interesting. So some people wrote to me. In fact, quite a few people wrote to me at the time saying that they agreed with my concerns, which sort of made it even more surprising that nobody had actually said so in public. Some people wrote to me saying they agreed with my concerns but weren't willing to say anything in public. James was, as always, was brilliantly helpful. James has always been really supportive, and James has been publicly supportive throughout this process. But it's because there have been a few courageous people like James and a few others, in Cambridge at that stage. That was definitely a big help. So there was some support. I also had people warning me. So I had people saying, you might get some kind of disciplinary procedure, you might get some kind of investigation. I didn't expect anything at that stage, and indeed nothing happened to me at that stage. And I'm pleased to say there've been no investigations or anything of me since. So
that's really interesting in two ways, isn't it? Because it shows you how loath people are to do this because they're afraid. And we shouldn't make light of that, because this is actually no fun. If you do something like this and it explodes in your face, like it probably took me a long time to recover from the disinvitation, especially the way it was handled. And my health and my wife's health were extremely compromised at the time. And so it came at a particularly bad time. We had just received news that she probably had terminal cancer. And so this came on top of that. Now, luckily that she survived, thank God. But, it was a harrowing time. And so I see why people can be cowed like this, because you don't know when this is going to explode and when it's going to tangle you up so deeply that, well, your job's gone. That's what happened to the Weinsteins, for example, at Evergreen. And I mean, that did them a tremendous amount of damage. They're unbelievably resourceful, and they got back on their feet. And they were a husband and wife team, so they had each other, and that was good. But not everybody can do that, and you can get seriously taken out if something like this goes wrong. So, but then that ties into this issue we discussed a bit earlier, which is how a small minority of, people whose wrath knows no bounds in some sense can be so dominant.
Yeah. So it was in some ways a calculated risk, and I mean I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for you, Jordan. It must have been horrific. One thing I saw happening in Cambridge, not quite then, but a little bit later, was the treatment that was meted out to not an academic, but to a member of the university staff. So we have college porters in Cambridge, and these are people who work at the colleges. Often they're sort of retired policemen or military or something. Really helpful. They do all kinds of jobs around the college. Students rely on them. The academics rely on them. The ones at my college are brilliant. There was one at a college in Cambridge who was also a Labour councillor, who resigned on political grounds, which was to do with his view about trans issues. So he thought it was there was a motion about trans issues that he thought threatened women's safety, and so he resigned on a point of principle. And that's his political activity. That's his right. I could understand his grounds for doing that. The students at his college, so these are typically much more privileged people than him. Students at his college formed a mob to try to get this man sacked. And this was they're much more privileged people. They didn't care about the consequences for him. They just thought because he diverted from their line of ideological purity. Do you remember this case, James? And James may know more about it than me, but yeah.
I do, and it was thanks to a very brave female undergraduate. I think she was in her second year. She spoke out, wrote a public article about it. Great courage, I thought to herself, and there was an awful lot of resistance to her doing that, but it was remarkable. She got in touch with us, I seem to remember, and I can't remember how the case was resolved.
Did you ever apologize? What happened with you?
Apologize for what?
Well, for whatever you were being accused of.
I never apologized for refusing to comply with my university's mandate. Mm-hmm. I never apologized for speaking publicly about it. I never have and won't apologize for continuing to try to have discussions about the truth. That doesn't mean that I or who I'm talking with will always get it right. Surely we'll make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes.
The truth isn't a set of facts. The truth is an approach to discussion. Mm-hmm. That's what Joe Rogan's so good at. That's why he's so popular. It's not because Joe knows the truth. It's because he acts out the truth in his speech and his actions. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a whole different thing.
Whole different thing.
Well, Solzhenitsyn was convinced that a totalitarian state could not exist unless everyone was participating in the lie, and that the most potent anti-authoritarian action is to tell the truth. And that means to say something when you have something to say, because not because you're brave, but because the alternative is worse.
Yeah, that's.
And it was Orwell. It's so interesting to me that it was Orwell that opened your eyes to that. I mean, it makes perfect sense, but it's still really something.
Yeah, I know. It's like that book. I think that's when I realized, everybody was responsible. And that's when I started thinking about speaking out.
That's when you started thinking about speaking out. Yeah. I see. Mm-hmm. And so you made a conscious decision at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I knew
Why?
Because I knew the price of silence. Because like that was a price we were paying, right? Like not even knowing. Like that's the thing. Like when people say, like, why no revolutions? Like, because we don't know we are slaves in North Korea. How do you fight to be free when you don't know you're a slave? And that's a different thing. Like the fact that my people don't even know they're oppressed. That's the thing. Like what kills me to this point about my father is not like of course I would be grateful he ever lived in freedom even one day. But the heartbreaking thing is he didn't even know life could be this free and life could be this beautiful. He didn't even know that. Like life could be so different for other human beings. I just wish he knew before he goes so he doesn't remember this life so hard, is filled with the sadness, And that's the thing with North Koreans. We are talking with different degree of oppression. They don't even know life can be this way. And yeah, so that was my time of understanding what happened and started believing in this freedom.